Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening. You're listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. Welcome to Season 6, Episode 11. I'm your host, Otis Jiry. In tonight's episode, I'll be performing 3 classic horror stories for you about cursed corpses, dastardly doctors, and awful artifacts, drawn from the depths of some of history's most macabre minds. You're listening to the standard edition of tonight's program, which contains the first 2 terrifying tales. If you'd like to show your support and enjoy an extended version of this and other episodes with twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons in the upper menu to sign up today. Thank you for your support. Now, it's time to take a walk together down the moonlit trail. So lock your doors, turn down your lights low and settle in. The show is about to begin. Our first tale tonight comes to us from Dr. Douglas Hyde, responsible for translating the fearsome Irish folktale to English. In it, a selfish young man has a fateful encounter with supernatural beings and is tormented by a terrible task fated to leave him changed forever. Without further ado, I present to you Teig O'Kane and the Corpse. There was once a grown-up lad in the county Leitrim, and he was strong and lively and the son of a rich farmer. His father had plenty of money, and he did not spare it on the son. Accordingly, when the boy grew up, he liked sport better than work, and as his father had no other children, he loved this one so much that he allowed him to do in everything just as it pleased himself. He was very extravagant, and he used to scatter the gold money as another person would scatter the white. He was seldom to be found at home, but if there was a fair, or a race, or a gathering within 10 miles of him, you were dead certain to find him there. And he seldom spent a night in his father's house, but he used to be always out rambling, and like Sean Bui long ago, there was the love of every girl in the breast of his shirt, and it's many the kiss he got and he gave, for he was very handsome, and there wasn't a girl in the country but would fall in love with him, only for him to fasten his 2 eyes on her, and it was for that reason someone immortalized him in a poem. Look at the rogue, it's for kisses he's rambling. It wasn't much wonder, for what was his way? He's like an old hedgehog, at night he'll be scrambling from this place to that, but he'll sleep in the day. At last he became very wild and unruly. He wasn't to be seen day or night in his father's house, but always rambling or going on his night visit from place to place, and from house to house, so that the old people used to shake their heads and say to one another, "It's easy seen what will happen to the land when the old man dies. His son will run through it in a year, and it won't stand him that long itself." He used to be always gambling and card playing and drinking, but his father never minded his bad habits and never punished him. But it happened one day that the old man was told that his son had ruined the character of a girl in the neighborhood, and he was greatly angry, and he called his son to him and said to him quietly and sensibly, "O son," says he, "you know I've loved you greatly up to this, and I never stopped you from doing your choice thing, whatever it was. And I kept plenty of money with you, and I always hoped to leave you the house and land, and all I had after myself would be gone. But I heard a story of you today that has disgusted me with you. I cannot tell you the grief that I felt when I heard such a thing of you, and I'll tell you now plainly that unless you marry that girl, I'll leave the house and land and everything to my brother's son. I never could leave it to anyone who would make so bad a use of it as you do yourself, deceiving women and coaxing girls. Settle with yourself now whether you'll marry that girl and get my land as a fortune with her, or refuse to marry her and give up all that was coming to you. And tell me in the morning which of the two things you've chosen." "What? Impossible! Father, you wouldn't say that to me. And I, such a good son as I am. Who told you I wouldn't marry the girl?" says he. But his father was gone, and the lad knew well enough that he would keep his word, too, and he was greatly troubled in his mind, for as quiet and as kind as his father was, he never went back of a word that he once said, and there wasn't another man in the country who was harder to bend than he was. The boy did not know rightly what to do. He was in love with the girl, indeed, and he hoped to marry her some time or other, but he would much sooner have remained another while he was, and follow on to his old tricks, drinking, sporting, and playing cards. And along with that he was angry that his father should order him to marry, and should threaten him if he did not. "Isn't my father a great fool?" he says to himself. "I was ready enough, and only too anxious, to marry Mary. And now, since he threatened me, faith, I've a great mind to let it go another while." His mind was so excited that he remained between two notions as to what to do. He walked out into the night at last to cool his heated blood, and went on to the road. He lit a pipe, and as the night was fine, he walked on and on, until the quick pace made him begin to forget his trouble. The night was bright, and the moon half full. There was not a breath of wind blowing, and the air was calm and mild. He walked on for nearly 3 hours, when he suddenly remembered that it was late in the night, and time for him to turn. "Gah! Look at the time. I think I forgot myself," he says. "It must be near 12 o'clock now." The word was hardly out of his mouth when he heard the sound of many voices and the trampling of feet on the road before him. "I don't know who it can be so late at night as this, on such a lonely road," he said to himself. He stood listening, and he heard the voices of many people talking through other, but he could not understand what they were saying. "Oh, Mother of God," says he, "I'm afraid. It's not Irish or English they have. It can't be. They're Frenchmen." He went on a couple of yards further, and he saw well enough by the light of the moon a band of little people coming toward him, and they were carrying something big and heavy with him. "Oh, murder," he says to himself. "Sure it can't be that they're the good people that's in it." Every rib of hair that was on his head stood up, and there fell a shaking on his bones, for he saw that they were coming to him fast. He looked at them again, and perceived that There were about 20 little men in it, and there was not a man at all of them higher than about 3 feet or 3 feet and a half, and some of them were gray and seemed very old. He looked again, but he could not make out what the heavy thing they were carrying was until they came up to them, and then they all stood round him. They threw the heavy thing down in the road, and he saw on the spot that it was a dead body. He became cold as the death, and there was not a drop of blood running in his vein, when an old gray maneen came up to him and said, "Isn't it lucky we met you, Teig O'Kane?" Poor Teig could not bring out a word at all, nor open his lips, if he were to get the world for it, and so he gave no answer. "Teig O'Kane," said the little gray man again, "isn't it timely you met us?" Teig could not answer him. "Teig O'Kane," says he, "the third time, isn't it lucky and timely that we met you?" But Teig remained silent, for he was afraid to return an answer, and his tongue was as if it was tied to the roof of his mouth. The little gray man turned to his companions, and there was joy in his bright little eye. "And now," says he, "Teig O'Kane hasn't said a word. We can do with him what we please. Teig, Teig," says he, "you're living a bad life, and we can make a slave of you now, and you cannot withstand us, for there's no use in trying to go against us. Lift that corpse." Teig was so frightened that he was only able to utter 2 words. "I won't." For as frightened as he was obstinate and stiff, the same as ever. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse," said the little man with a wicked little laugh, for all the world like the breaking of a bundle of dry twigs, and with a harsh little voice, like the striking of a cracked bell. "Teig O'Kane won't lift the corpse. Make him lift it." And before the word was out of his mouth, they all had gathered round poor Teig, and they were talking and laughing through other. Teig tried to run from them, but they followed him, and a man of them stretched out his foot before him as he ran, so that Teig was thrown in a heap of the road. Then, before he could rise up, the fairies caught him, some by the hands, some by the feet, and they held him tight in a way that he could not stir, with his face against the ground. 6 or 7 of them raised the body then, and pulled it over to him, and left it down on his back. The breast of the corpse was squeezed against Teig's back and shoulders, and the arms of the corpse were thrown around Teig's neck. Then they stood back from him a couple of yards, and let him get up. He rose, foaming at the mouth and cursing, and he shook himself, thinking to throw the corpse off his back. But his fear and his wonder were great when he found that the 2 arms had a tight hold around his own neck, and that the 2 legs were squeezing his hips firmly, and that, however strongly he tried, he could not throw it off, any more than a horse can throw off its saddle. He was terribly frightened then, and he thought he was lost. "Woe to me forever," said he to himself. "It's a bad life I'm leading that hasn't given the good people this power over me. I promised to God, Mary, Peter and Paul, Patrick and Bridget, that I'll mend my ways for as long as I have to live, if I come clear out of this danger, and I'll marry the girl." The gray little man came up to him again and said to him, "Now, Teig," says he, "you didn't lift the body when I told you to lift it, and see how you were made to lift it. Perhaps when I tell you to bury it, you won't bury it until you're made to bury it. Anything at all that I can do for your honor," said Teig, "I'll do it." For he was getting sense already, and if it had not been for the great fear that was on him, He never would have let that civil word slip out of his mouth. The little man laughed a sort of laugh again. "You're getting quiet now, Teig," says he. "I'll go bail, but you'll be quiet enough before I'm done with you. Listen to me now, Teig O'Kane, and if you don't obey me in all I'm telling you to do, you'll repent it. You must carry with you this corpse that is on your back to Teampole de Meuse, and you must bring it into the church with you and make a grave for it in the very middle of the church, and you must raise up the flags and put them down again the very same way, and you must carry the clay out of the church and leave the place as it was when you came, so that no one could know that there had been anything changed. But that's not all. Maybe that the body won't be allowed to be buried in that church. Perhaps some other man has the bed, and if so, it's likely he won't share it with this one. If you don't get leave to bury it in Teampole de Meuse, you must carry it to Carrick Fad Vic Ors and bury it in the churchyard there. And if you don't get it into that place, take it with you to Teampole Ronan. And if that churchyard is closed on you, take it to Imlog Fada. And if you're not being able to bury it there, you've no more to do than to take it to Kilbreedger, and you can bury it there without hindrance. I cannot tell you what one of these churches is the one where you will leave to bury that corpse under the clay, but I know that it will be allowed you to bury him at some church or other of them. If you do this work rightly, we will be thankful to you, and you will have no cause to grieve. But if you are slow or lazy, believe me, we shall take satisfaction of you." When the gray little man had done speaking, his comrades laughed and clapped their hands together. "Glick, glick, whee, whee!" they all cried. "Go on, go on! You have 8 hours before you till daybreak, and if you haven't this man buried before the sun rises, you're lost." They struck a fist and a foot behind him and drove him on the road. He was obliged to walk, and to walk fast, for they gave him no rest. He thought himself that there was not a wet path or a dirty lane or a crooked contrary road in the whole county that he had not walked that night. The night was at times very dark, and whenever there would come a cloud across the moon, he could see nothing, and then he used often to fall. Sometimes he was hurt, sometimes he escaped, but he was obliged to always rise on the moment and to hurry on. Sometimes the moon would break out clearly, and then he would look behind him and see the little people following at his back, and he heard them speaking amongst themselves, talking and crying out and screaming like a flock of seagulls, and if he was to save his soul, he never understood as much as one word of what they were saying. He did not know how far he had walked, when at last one of them cried out to him, "Stop here!" He stood, and they all gathered round him. "Do you see those withered trees over there?" said the old boy to him again. "Teampole de Meuse is among those trees, and you must go in there by yourself, for we cannot follow you or go with you. We must remain here. Go on boldly." Teig looked from him, and he saw a high wall that was, in places, half broken down, and an old grey church on the inside of the wall, and about a dozen withered old trees scattered here and there round it. There was neither leaf nor twig on any of them, but their bare, crooked branches were stretched out like the arms of an angry man when he threatens. He had no help for it, but he was obliged to go for it. He was a couple of 100 yards from the church, but he walked on and never looked behind him until he came to the gate of the churchyard. The old gate was thrown down, and he had no difficulty in entering. He turned then to see if any of the little people were following him, but there came a cloud over the moon, and the night became so dark that he could see nothing. He went into the churchyard, and he walked up the old grassy pathway leading up to the church. When he reached the door, he found it locked. The door was large and strong, and he did not know what to do. At last he drew out his knife with difficulty and stuck it in the wood to try if it were not rotten, but it was not. "Now," he said to himself, "I have no more to do. The door is shut, and I can't open it." Before the words were rightly shaped in his own mind, a voice in his ear said to him, "Search for the key on the top of the door or on the wall." He started. "Who's that speaking to me?" he cried, turning round. But he saw no one. The voice said in his ear again, "Search for the key on the top of the door or on the wall." "Who's that? What's that?" he said, and the sweat running from his forehead. "Who spoke to me?" "It's I, the corpse that spoke to you," said the voice. "Can you talk?" said Teig. "Now and again," said the corpse. Teig searched for the key, and he found it on the top of the wall. He was too much frightened to say any more, but he opened the door wide, and as quickly as he could he went in, with the corpse on his back. It was as dark as pitch inside, and poor Teig began to shake and tremble. "Light the candle," said the corpse. Teig put his hand in his pocket, as well as he was able, and drew out a flint and steel. He struck a spark out of it, and lit a burnt rag he had in his pocket. He blew it until it made a flame, and he looked around him. The church was very ancient, and part of the wall was broken down. The windows were blown in or cracked, and the timber of the seats were rotten. There were 6 or 7 old iron candlesticks left there still, and in one of these candlesticks Teig found the stump of an old candle, and he lit it. He was still looking round him on the strange and horrid place in which he had found himself, when the cold corpse whispered in his ear, "Bury me now, bury me now. There's a spade, and turn the ground." Teig looked from him, and he saw a spade lying beside the altar. He took it up, and he placed the blade under a flag that was in the middle of the aisle, and leaning all his weight on the handle of the spade, he raised it. When the first flag was raised, it was not hard to raise the others near it, and he moved 3 or 4 of them out of their places. The clay that was under them was soft and easy to dig, but he had not thrown up more than 3 or 4 shovelfuls when he felt the iron touch something soft like flesh. He threw up 3 or 4 more shovelfuls from around it, and then he saw that it was another body that was buried in the same place. "I'm afraid I'll never be allowed to bury the 2 bodies in the same hole," said Teig in his own mind. "You corpse, there in my back," he says. "Will you be satisfied if I buried you down there?" But the corpse never answered him a word. "Well, that's a good sign," said Teig to himself. "Maybe he's getting quiet." And he thrust the spade down in the earth again. Perhaps he hurt the flesh of the other body, for the dead man that was buried there stood up in the grave and shouted an awful shout. "Ho, ho, ho! Go, go, go! Or you're a dead man! Dead, dead, dead man!" And then he fell back in the grave again. Teig said afterward that of all the wonderful things that he saw that night, that was the most awful to him. His hair stood upright on his head like the bristles of a pig. The cold sweat ran off his face, and then came a tremor over all of his bones until he thought that he must fall. But after a while he became bolder, when he saw that the second corpse remained lying quietly there, and he threw in the clay on it again, and he smoothed it overhead. He laid down the flags carefully, as they had been before. "It can't be that he'll rise up any more," said he. He went down the aisle a little further and drew near to the door and began raising the flags again, looking for another bed for the corpse on his back. He took up 3 or 4 flags and put them aside, and then he dug the clay. He was not long digging until he laid bare an old woman without a thread upon her but her shirt. She was more lively than the first corpse, for he had scarcely taken any of the clay away from about her when she sat up and began to cry, "Ha! You clown! You fool! Where has been that he got no bed?" Poor Teig drew back, and when she found that she was getting no answer, she closed her eyes gently, lost her vigor, and fell back quietly and slowly under the clay. Teig did to her as he had done to the man. He threw the clay back on her and left the flags down overhead. He began digging again near the door, but before he had thrown up more than a couple of shovelfuls, he noticed a man's hand lay bare by the spade. "By my soul, I'll go no further then," he said to himself. "What use is it for me?" And he threw the clay on it again and settled the flags as they had been seen before. He left the church then, and his heart was heavy enough, but he shut the door and locked it, and left the key where he found it. He sat down on the tombstone that was near the door and began thinking. He was in great doubt what he should do. He laid his face between his two hands and cried for grief and fatigue, since he was dead certain at this time that he never would come home alive. He made another attempt to loosen the hands of the corpse that were squeezed round his neck, but they were as tight as if they were clamped, and the more he tried to loosen them, the tighter they squeezed him. He was going to sit down once more, when the cold, horrid lips of the dead man said to him, "Carrick fad vic oris," and he remembered the command of the good people to bring the corpse with him to that place, if he should be unable to bury it where he had been. He rose up and looked about him. "I don't know the way," he said. As soon as he had uttered the word, the corpse stretched out suddenly its left hand that had been tightened around his neck, and kept it pointing out, showing him the road he ought to follow. Teig went in the direction that the fingers were stretched, and passed out in the churchyard. He found himself on an old, ruddy, stony road, and he stood still again, not knowing where to turn. The corpse stretched out its bony hand a second time, and pointed out to him another road, not the road by which he had come when approaching the old church. Teig followed that road, and whenever he came to a path or road meeting it, the corpse always stretched out its hand and pointed with its fingers, showing him the way he was to take. Many were crossroads he turned down, and many were the crooked lanes he walked, until he saw from him an old burying ground at last, beside the road. But there was neither church nor chapel, nor any other building in it. The corpse squeezed him tightly, and he stood. Bury me in the burying ground," said the voice. Teig drew over toward the old burying place, and he was not more than about 20 yards from it, when, raising his eyes, he saw hundreds and hundreds of ghosts, men, women, and children, sitting on top of the wall round it, or standing on the inside of it, or running backwards and forwards, and pointing at him, while he could see their mouths opening and shutting as if they were speaking, though he heard no word nor any sound amongst them all. He was afraid to go forward, so he stood where he was, and the moment he stood, all the ghosts became quiet and ceased moving. Then Teig understood that it was trying to keep him from going in, that they were. He walked a couple of yards forward, and immediately the whole crowd rushed together toward the spot to which he was moving, and they stood so thickly together that it seemed to him that he could never break through them, even though he had a mind to try. But he had no mind to try it. He went back broken and dispirited, and when he had gone a couple of 100 yards from the burying ground, he stood again, for he did not know which way to go. He heard the voice of the corpse in his ear, saying, "Timbo Ronin," and the skinny hand was stretched out again, pointing him out the road. As tired as he was, he had to walk, and the road was neither short nor even. The night was darker than ever, and it was difficult to make his way. Many was the toss he got, and many a bruise they left on his body. At last he saw Teampole Ronan from him in the distance, standing in the middle of the burying ground. He moved over toward it, and thought he was all right and safe, when he saw neither ghosts nor anything else on the wall, and he thought he would never be hindered now from leaving his load off him at last. He moved over to the gate, but as he was passing in, he tripped on the threshold. Before he could recover himself, something that he could not see seized him by the neck, by the hands, and by the feet, and bruised him and shook him and choked him until he was nearly dead. And at last he was lifted up and carried more than 100 yards from that place, and then thrown down in an old dike with the corpse still clinging to him. He rose up bruised and sore, but feared to go near the place again, for he had seen nothing the time he was thrown down and carried away. "You, corpse, up on my back," he said. "Shall I go over again to the churchyard?" But the corpse never answered him. "That's a sign you don't wish me to try it again?" said Teig. He was now in great doubt as to what he ought to do, when the corpse spoke in his ear and said, "Imlog fada." "Oh, murder," said Teig. "Must I bring you there? If you keep me long walking like this, I tell you I'll fall under you." He went on, however, in the direction the corpse pointed out to him. He could not have told himself how long he had been going, when the dead man behind suddenly squeezed him and said, "There!" Teig looked from him, and he saw a little low wall that was so broken down in places that it was no wall at all. It was in a great wide field in from the road, and only for 3 or 4 great stones at the corners that were more like rocks than stones. There was nothing to show that there was either graveyard or burying ground there. "Is this Imlog Fada? Shall I bury you here?" said Teig. "Yes," said the voice. "But I see no grave or gravestone, only this pile of stones," said Teig. The corpse did not answer, but stretched out its long, fleshless hand to show Teig the direction in which he was to go. Teig went on accordingly, but he was greatly terrified, for he remembered what had happened to him at the last place. He went on with his heart in his mouth, as he said himself afterward, but when he came to within 15 or 20 yards of the little low square wall, there broke out a flash of lightning, bright yellow and red, with blue streaks in it, and went round the wall in one course, and it swept by as fast as the swallow in the clouds, and the longer Teig remained looking at it, the faster it went, till at last it became like a bright ring of flame round the old graveyard, which no one could pass without being burnt by it. Teig never saw, from the time he was born, and never saw afterward, so wonderful or so splendid a sight as that was. Round went the flame, white and yellow and blue sparks, leaping out from it as it went, and although at first it had been no more than a thin, narrow line, it increased slowly until it was at last a great broad band, and it was continually getting broader and higher, and throwing out more brilliant sparks, till there was never a color on the ridge of the earth that was not to be seen in that fire, and lightning never shone, and flame never flamed, that was so shining and so bright as that. Teig was amazed. He was half dead with fatigue, and he had no courage left to approach the wall. There fell a mist over his eyes, and he was overcome with vertigo, and he was obliged to sit down upon a great stone to recover himself. He could see nothing but the light, and he could hear nothing but the whir of it as it shot round the paddock faster than a flash of lightning. As he sat there on the stone, the voice whispered once more into his ear, "Kill Breeja." And the dead man squeezed him so tightly that he cried out. He rose again, sick, tired, and trembling, and went forward as he was directed. The wind was cold, and the road was bad, and the load upon his back was heavy, and the night was dark, and he himself was nearly worn out, and if he had had very much further to go, he must have fallen dead under his burden. At last the corpse stretched out its hand and said to him, "Bury me there." "This is the last burying place," said Teig in his own mind, "and the little gray man said I'd be allowed to bury him in some of them, so it must be this. It can't be, but they'll let him in here." The first faint streak of the ring of day was appearing in the east, and the clouds were beginning to catch fire, but it was darker than ever, for the moon was set and there were no stars. Make haste, said the corpse, and Teig hurried forward as well as he could to the graveyard, which was a little place on a bare hill with only a few graves in it. He walked boldly in through the open gate, and nothing touched him, nor did he either hear or see anything. He came to the middle of the ground and then stood up and looked round him for a spade or shovel to make a grave. As he was turning round and searching, he suddenly perceived what startled him greatly: a newly dug grave right before him. He moved over to it and looked down, and there at the bottom he saw a black coffin. He clambered down into the hole and lifted the lid and found that, as he thought it would be, the coffin was empty. He had hardly mounted up out of the hole and was standing on the brink when the corpse, which had clung to him for more than 8 hours, suddenly relaxed its hold on his neck and loosened its shin from around his hips and sank down with a plop into the open coffin. Teig fell down on his 2 knees at the brink of the grave and gave thanks to God. He made no delay then, but pressed down the coffin lid in its place and threw in the clay over it with his 2 bare hands. And when the grave was filled up, he stamped and leaped on it with its feet until it was firm and hard, and then he left the place. The sun was fast rising as he finished his work, and the first thing he did was to return to the road and look out for a house to rest in. He found an inn at last and lay down upon a bed there and slept till night. Then he rose up and ate a little and fell asleep again till morning. When he awoke in the morning, he hired a horse and rode home. He was more than 26 miles from home where he was, and he had come all that way with the dead body on his back in one night. All the people at his own home thought he must have left the country, and they rejoiced greatly when they saw him come back. Everyone began asking him where he had been, but he would not tell anyone except his father. He was a changed man from that day. He never drank too much, he never lost his money over cards, and especially he would not take the world and be out late by himself of a dark night. He was not a fortnight at home until he married Mary, the girl he had been in love with, and it's at their wedding the sport was, and it's he was the happy man from that day forward, and it's all I wish that we may be as happy as he was. I hope you enjoyed Teig O'Kane and the Corpse, as translated from an Irish folktale by Dr. Douglas Hyde. Up next, we've got another second tale of terror from the halls of horror history, courtesy of author Robert Louis Stevenson, a Scottish novelist, poet, and travel writer, most well known, perhaps, as the writer of classics such as Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Although Stevenson passed away more than a century ago, his work lives on. In tonight's tale, a group of friends are together for drinks when an eminent doctor, noted for his suspicious behavior, shows up, triggering a tense confrontation. Will anyone be able to piece together the doctor's dark secrets? or will his deeds be buried with him? Stay tuned and find out. Without further ado, I present to you The Body Snatcher. Every night of the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlor of the George at Debenham, the undertaker, and the landlord, and Fadus, and myself. Sometimes there'd be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would be, each planted in his own particular armchair. Fadus was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education, obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlor at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things of course in Debenham. He had some vague radical opinions, and some fleeting infidelities which he would now and again set forth, and emphasize with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George, sat with his glass in his right hand in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and have been known on a pinch to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation, but beyond these slight particulars we had no knowledge of his character or antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us. There was a sick man in the George. A great neighboring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What's his name?" "Dr. McFarlane," said the landlord. Fadus was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly fuddled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him. But at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name, McFarlane, twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion at the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe McFarlane." Fadus became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I'm afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe McFarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, "It cannot be, he added, "and yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" said the undertaker with a gasp. "God forbid," was the reply. "And yet the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy, too. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older. But," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and a good digestion. Conscience! Hear me speak. You would think I was some good old decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted, if he stood in my shoes, but the brains, with the rattling fillip on his bald head, the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions." "If you know this, doctor," I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, I would gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fettes paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision. "I must see him face to face." There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlor to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost on the street. There was room for a turkey rug, and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. But this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the barroom window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fettes walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. McFarland was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest broadcloth and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad folded tie, white and bespeckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing, as he did, of wealth and consideration, and it was a surprising contrast to see our parlor sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet coat, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "McFarland," he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy McFarland," repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, and then, in a startled whisper, "Fettes," he said. "You?" "Aye," said the other. "Me. Did you think I was dead, too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush!" exclaimed the doctor. "Hush, hush! This meeting is so unexpected. I can see you are unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess, at first, but I'm overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present, it must be how d'ye do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fettes. I fear you are out at elbows, but we must see to that, for old lang syne, as we sang once at suppers." "Money!" cried Fettes. "Money from you! The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain." Dr. McFarland had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. "My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however." "I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you," interrupted the other. "I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wished to know if, after all, there were a God. I know now that there is none. Begone!" He stood still in the middle of the rug, between the stairway and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles, but while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not yet entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fettes clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, and yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great, rich London doctor cried out loud with a sharp, throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and, with his hands over his head, fled out the door like a detected thief. Before it had occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of its passage. Next day, the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the bar-room window, and Fettes at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fettes," said the landlord, coming first in possession of his customary senses. "What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you've been saying." Fettes turned toward us. He looked us each in succession in the face. "See if you can hold your tongues," said he. "That man, MacFarlane, is not safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth, under the lamp of the hotel, into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlor, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and we recapitulated what had passed. The first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the Old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears, and readily retails it to his own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was, in those days, well-favored and pleased by his exterior. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of autonomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due to, partly, his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students, at least, swore by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he had acquired the favor of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant, as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly allusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities, Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theater and lecture-room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate, affair that he was lodged by Mr. K. in the same wing, and at last in the same building, with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hand still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remained alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night, and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions, cold, light, and selfish in the last resort. He had that modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomists kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K. to ask no questions in his dealing with the trade. They bring me the body, and we pay the price. He used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo, and again, and somewhat profanely, ask no questions, he would tell his assistants, for conscience' sake. There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror, but the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was in itself an offense against good manners and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fetis, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog, abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He'd been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen, at last, into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty, and the town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fetis, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned, dozing, with his shoulder propped up against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer, with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That's Jane Galbraith." The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fettes deeply and darkly in the eyes, and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his faithful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw, with horror, marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skillful on the ice or the links, with a skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and, to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fettes he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fettes heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause for his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod. "It looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fettes. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything? Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fettes. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "I hope not," said McFarlane. "And if anyone does, well, you didn't, don't you see? And there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how many one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves, in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that practically speaking, all of our subjects have been murdered." "McFarlane!" cried Fettes. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself." "Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know, and I'm as sorry as you are this should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing for me is to not recognize it. And," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy that is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives. This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fettis. He agreed to imitate McFarland. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fettis dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarland sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he approved, upon a nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarland, issued orders like the great Bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the civility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fettis on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honored him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but McFarland is the boy. Toddy McFarland, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass." Or it might be, "Toddy, you jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh, yes, Toddy, you do. Don't you call me that confounded name," growled McFarland. "Harem, did you ever see the lads play knife? He would like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fettis. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." McFarland looked up sharply, as though this jest were scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fettis to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and, when all done, commanded McFarland to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man, Gray, was incapably drunk. McFarland, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander, and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fettis, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps, and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day McFarland was absent from class, and Fettis smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere, so returned early to his rooms, went to bed early, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 a.m. he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarland with his gig, and in the gig one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But McFarland silenced him roughly, bidding him to turn to business. When they got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarland made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You'd better get a look at the face," he said in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fettis only stared at him in wonder. "But where and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fettis was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death, and naked upon the coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left, well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke even in the thoughtless Fetus some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a crastaby which re-echoed in his soul, that two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolf. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarland himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulders. "Richardson," he said, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fetus found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, and on every possible account, you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if they were all right. Where does old K keep his money?" "There," answered Fetus hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. McFarland could not suppress a nervous twitch, an infinitesimal mark of the immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out a pen and ink, and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in a drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There is the payment made, first proof of your good faith, first step to your security. You have now to clinch it by a second, enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fetus an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors, it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome, if he could avoid a present quarrel with McFarland. He set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "Now," said McFarland, "it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket, I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "McFarland," began Fetus, still somewhat hoarsely, "I've put my neck in a halter to oblige you." "You oblige me!" cried Wolf. "Oh, come! You did, as near as I can see the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defense. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray is the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning, that's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of faith seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. "My God!" he cried. "But what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant, in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position, Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now?" "My dear fellow," said McFarland, "what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue. Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You staggered at the first. But look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever, you have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt, and I tell you, on my honor and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce. And with that, McFarlane took his departure and drove off up the wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fettes was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that from concession to concession he had followed from the arbiter of McFarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Gray were dealt out to one and the other and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom, before it rang, Fettes trembled with the exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day McFarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular, he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, McFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fettes had outlived his terrors and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and McFarlane was, from first to last, particularly kind and jovial. But it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fettes whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length, an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K. was again short of subjects. The pupils were eager, and it was a part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time, there came news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then, as now, upon a crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighboring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind in mountainous old flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use a by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. to rustic neighborhoods where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task, to bodies that had been laid in earth, in joyful expectation of a far different awakening. There came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as two vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fettis and MacFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, and been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried dead and naked to that faraway city that she had always honored with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Pennacook, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst, to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whiskey with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was hosed. The horse was fed and comforted, and the two young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them, added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon MacFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said. "Between friends, this little deedy accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights." Fetish pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay between you, by Lord Harry. But you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man, I tell you. It required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the deedy thing. But not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fettis thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in his boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang. That's practical. But for all cant, MacFarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities. They may frighten boys, but men of this world, like you and me, despise them. Heirs to the memory of Grey." It was, by this time, growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door, with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction till they were clear of the last house of the town. Then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course and followed a by-road toward Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage, and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was at a foot pace, and almost groping, that they picked their way through that resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illuminate one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded with a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment MacFarlane, having heard his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped the better to illuminate their labors against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank, descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. The night fell upon them. Sounds, alternately dull and ringing, announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at the end of their abhorred task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in its place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along by wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. There was a faint, diffused radiancy, which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace, and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations. Now, as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one, and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with the greater haste, and the process, natural although it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. MacFarlane made some ill-favored jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips, and was allowed to drop in silence. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Finis. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sakes," he said, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sakes, let's have a light." Seemingly, MacFarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had, by that time, got no further than the crossroad town to Auchenclinny. The rain still poured as though the deluge was returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify and shed a wide circle of misty brightness around the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had along with them. The rain had molded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modeled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time McFarland stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet about the body, and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fetus. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, kept mounting in his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That's not a woman," said McFarland in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fetus. "Hold that lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Fetus took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clearly upon the dark, well-molded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both of these young men. A wild yell rang up in the night. Each leapt from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it the sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Gray. I hope you enjoyed The Body Snatcher by author Robert Louis Stevenson. As a reminder, all of tonight's tales are in the public domain and are just a small sample of the incredible work these authors, and many more, have contributed to the horror genre over the past centuries. If you'd like to hear or read more, check out my friends at LibriVox.org for audio recordings of hundreds more, or Project Gutenberg to access their enormous archives of classic tales of horror. You won't be sorry you did. Thanks for your support of those keeping these tales alive for future generations to enjoy. I'd like to personally thank you for joining me for this episode of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. If you enjoyed what you've heard on today's program, please take a moment to stop by our iTunes page or wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts, and leave us a 5-star review and a kind word. It makes a huge difference and would mean a lot to us. If you'd like to hear a premium extended edition of tonight's and all of our other episodes featuring twice the terror, visit simplyscarypodcast.com today and click the Patrons link in the menu at the top of the screen. You'll find yourself at chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where you can purchase season passes for this podcast and our other quality storytelling programs, or become a patron for as little as $5 per month and get access to our entire audio archive dating back to 2012, all of it ad-free. If you happen to use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you can follow and subscribe to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights there, where you'll get all of our latest updates and new releases and have the chance to interact with us each and every week. You can now subscribe to me on YouTube as well at the Otis Jiry channel, where you'll find releases of my series Horror Storytime dating back to 2014. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram too. Just search for Otis Jiry. Until next week, stay spooky and get some sleep, if you can. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.